Hello, my name is Sofia Seinfeld. I'm currently a lecturer and researcher in the Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya. However, I did my PhD in EDVAPS under the supervision of Dr. Mavi Sanchez Vives. And today I will present you a study that I carried out when I was working in this institution in collaboration with Maastricht University, where we basically try to disentangle what is the neural impact of becoming a victim in immersive virtual reality. I want to thank the VR per Gender project, who is organizing this series of talks and invite me to submit this talk. So the outline of my talk will be the following. First, I will present you what is the research problem that we want to address and some background on related work. Then I will show you what is the experimental design we use, the VR setup, the measures, explain you the results, and at the end I will highlight the main contributions and conclusions of this study. So what is the research problem and background? So first I want to give you a background on what is the prevalence of domestic violence across the world. And I will base this data on a study carried out by the World Health Organization in 2013, where they showed that 30% of women across the world has experienced violence from an intimate partner. And 38% of all murders of women across the world have been committed by their intimate partners. So basically, this is a very important problem, not just within the European Union, but also in other developed and non-developed countries. Just focusing on the European Union, we know that they spend an average of 109 billion euros per year in costs resulting from gender-based violence. However, there is limited evidence on the efficacy of current rehabilitation programs for domestic violence. So we currently don't have an effective solution in order to tackle this problem. And this problem of domestic violence has just been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, in Spain, during the month where there was a strict lockdown, there was a significant increase on the number of calls made to the emergency numbers for intimate partner violence when compared to data of the same month, but for other years where there was not a lockdown. So basically, current interventions for domestic violence try to tackle a series of difficulties that several studies have observed in this type of populations. So, for example, there is studies showing that offenders might have poor anger management skills, cognitive distortions related to women, low self-esteem, comorbid substance abuse problems, and among these difficulties, it has also been shown that offenders might have low empathic abilities, including difficulties in perspective taking and emotion recognition. So we do know from past evidence that one of the factors that influence the fact that violent aggressions occur is offenders' poor recognition of the distress experienced by the victims. And this is why current interventions always include some type of training method in order to enhance empathy for the victim. So in traditional rehabilitation programs, for example, offenders perform a role-playing where they have to put themselves in the perspective of the victim, or they might watch movies related to the topic of domestic violence, or they can also read testimonies of the victims. However, all these methods rely on, one, the motivation of the offender to put himself in the perspective of the victims, which frequently is low because, just to remind you, many of these offenders are attending the therapy because they are court mandated, not because they want to attend. So motivation in this type of treatments tends to be low. And also they depend on the ability of the offender to put himself with his imagination in the perspective of the victim. So what we do know is that all the rehabilitation programs for offenders use some type of technique to put offenders in the shoes of their victims. So in order to overcome some of these shortcomings, we thought about exploiting embodiment in virtual reality to put offenders in the actual perspective of the victims. So how is this achieved? So basically through the use of head-mounted display and some type of body tracking devices, we can basically substitute the body of the participant for a virtual life-size body that he experiences from a first-person perspective. And also, when he executes movements with his own real body, these movements are reflected in real time by the virtual body movements, giving a strong sense of owning the virtual body and also of agency over that virtual body. Interestingly, we also know from several studies that these embodiment illusions are not a perceptual illusion of ownership for an artificial body, but that also the type of body in which participants are embodied can have different impact on their physiological reactions, cognitions, and behaviors. Just to give you one example, for example, when participants are embodied in a virtual body with dark skin, they tend to reduce their implicit racial bias compared to when they are embodied in a white skin avatar or in a body with a strange color such as purple, but that is not black. So based on this previous knowledge, we created a VR scene where participants used a head-mounted display, and we also tracked their body movements. And as you can see, participants explore the virtual environment and their new virtual bodies.
La habitación es blanca, hay una mesa, un cuadro, veo una alfombra roja también.
After this, participants executed a motor task in order to enhance their embodiment
las esferas, estas
illusion.
Aparecerán en otro lugar. Toca las esferas para comenzar.
Then a male avatar entered the scene and started to verbally abuse the female avatar, or the participants embodied in the female avatar.
¡Que te calles! ¿Has visto la pinta que tienes? ¿Dónde vas así? Me vas a aclararte un poco, ¿no? Parece que tengas 20 años encima, además.
At some point, the avatar carried out a physical act of violence by throwing a telephone to the floor.
Eso sí que te gusta, hablar por el teléfono. ¿Eh? Pues eso se va a acabar. Eso se va a acabar. ¿Ves el teléfono? ¿Lo ves? A tomar por el culo el teléfono.
And at the end of the scene, the male avatar was very close to the participant, invading his personal space.
Que es que todo esto es culpa mía. Todo esto es culpa mía. Si es que he sido muy blando contigo. He tenido mucha paciencia contigo. ¿Por qué? Porque te quiero. Porque te quiero.
So in a first study with this virtual reality scene, publishing scientific reports, you can basically access the paper and see the results in detail. We administer an emotion recognition test before and after the virtual reality experience. And what we observe is that on a baseline level, when we compared offenders with a control group of males without a history of violence, offenders had a deficit to recognize fear in female faces. Something that was not new, because there were also previous studies finding similar emotional deficits in this type of populations. But interestingly, we observed that after the virtual reality experience, there was an enhancement, a specific enhancement of fear recognition in female faces. And this did not happen for male fearful faces. So there was an improvement of offenders' emotion recognition deficits after the virtual experience. So, in order to better understand the behavioral results found in our first study published in Scientific Reports, we decided to do a further study in collaboration with Maastricht University to understand what were the underlying neural mechanisms explaining these effects on emotion recognition after becoming a victim in virtual reality. So basically, our research question was with this new study, what are the underlying brain mechanisms associated with emotion recognition changes related to being embodied in the perspective of a female virtual victim of domestic violence in immersive virtual reality? I will go through the experimental design, the measures, the main results of this study, but of course you have the full reference of this study published in Cortex below, and you can go directly to read the paper if you want to know more details of the information I'm giving in this video. Our experimental design was based on a within groups design where we included 14 participants with the lowest sensitivity to recognize fear in female faces. And the way that we used to screen participants was basically we designed a behavioral test where participants had to classify faces gradually morphing from a happy expression to a fearful expression, and we administered this test to a pool of 114 participants. And we selected those who specifically gave less fear responses for classifying the emotion of these ambiguous facial stimuli. We used a block design, a block fMRI design with catch trials that we basically perform before and after the immersive virtual reality experience. The virtual reality experience used was the same one as I showed you in the previous video. However, since this study was performed in Maastricht University in the Netherlands, we just had to dub the scene to Deutsch, since all the participants had as their native language Deutsch. The measures included in this study were first behavioral measures based on this psychophysical morph test, where participants judge whether the faces were expressing fear or happiness. And as I told you, these faces were morphing in several steps from one expression to the other. So many of these faces were ambiguous. The fMRI data. We also administer as additional information the interpersonal reactivity index, the Bus-Perry aggression questionnaire, and a virtual reality questionnaire. So our fMRI design was based on the following. So the stimuli we presented inside the scan varied in two main factors. First, the gender of the stimuli, which could be male or female. For each gender, we included different identities to not create a familiarity effect. And the second factor was the step of the morph that participants observe. Since we had a limited time to scan the participants and the experiment was quite long, we presented 3 steps of a 9-step morph continua. And from these steps, we selected a step that clearly showed faces that express a fearful expression. We also select a morph step that was more in the middle of the morph continua, so it was more ambiguous, expressing partly fearful and happy expressions. And we selected a morph step that was more towards the end of the happy continua. So it expressed more happiness than fear. So we had a more clearer fearful expression, a more ambiguous one, and then a face that was more clearly expressing fear against happiness. The procedure we followed for our study was the following. So 3 to 4 weeks before the scanning session, we applied the behavioral screening test that I showed before, where we selected those participants with the lowest sensitivity to recognize fear in female faces. Once we invited those participants to participate in the fMRI scanning session, we did the fMRI part of the experiment within the same day, and it consisted in the following. So first, participants went through an fMRI scan where we presented all the emotional morphs. We presented all stimuli twice in order to also control for habituation effects. Once participants passively observe all these emotional stimuli, we ask them to come out of the fMRI scan, and in a separate room, they experience the virtual reality scene with the head-mounted display, with the full body tracking. Once the scene was finished, we covered their eyes, and we immediately took them back to the fMRI scan, where they observed the same emotional stimuli that they observed in the pre-fMRI session, and also the stimuli was repeated twice. Once these two fMRI scans were done, we also ran a functional localizer run and a resting state fMRI scan. And at the end, participants went out of the scanner and answered all the behavioral questionnaires, such as the interpersonal reactivity index, virtual reality questionnaire. But before that, they also completed the behavioral morphing test after the VR experience, so we could compare their scores with the pre-VR experience. So I will just go through the main results of this study. As I told you, there's more details inside the paper, so please go to the paper in case you want to read through the results in more detail. So the main results we found with this study is that when we compare the post-fMRI scanning session compared to the pre-fMRI scanning session, we observe that after the VR experience, there was significantly more activation in clusters, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the early visual cortex, the thalamus, and the supramarginal gyrus. All these regions belonging to the default mode network. So once we had this overall picture of the whole brain analysis, we went on to do a region of interest analysis in the PCC, TPJ, AT, MPFC, amygdala, and fusiform, because we basically wanted to further understand if the effects produced by the virtual reality experience on emotion recognition was based more on enhanced processing for visual features of the face, which could be reflected by higher activation in the fusiform or the amygdala, or if it was based more on higher activation of social cognition processes, which we expected to be linked to default mode network activity. And our results indicate that the enhancements seem to specifically be related to these more social cognition processes, because we specifically observe enhanced default mode network activity for ambiguous expressions after the virtual reality experience. Interestingly, the activity decreased when participants observe fully fearful expressions, and patterns for processing stimuli between the two genders became more variable across runs in several default mode network regions. However, no significant changes were observed in regions such as the fusiform, and also no changes were observed in amygdala activity. So our evidence seemed to indicate that the changes in emotion recognition seem to be more related to social cognition processes and not to enhance processing of the visual features of the faces per se. So what are the main contributions and conclusions of our study? Well, in our first study, we found that domestic violence offenders have a deficit recognizing fearful female faces when compared to non-offenders, and a higher bias towards classifying both male and female fearful faces as happy rather than fearful compared to non-offenders. So basically, this first study showed us that embodiment in a virtual female victim improves offenders' ability to recognize fear in female faces and reduces response bias towards wrongly attributing happy emotional states to fearful facial expressions. In our further study, the study that I presented here today in my talk, we have found that these emotion recognition changes are associated with the default mode network. So they seem to be related to internally directed processing, social cognition processes, probably associated with empathy and perspective taking. But changes do not seem to be related to enhanced processing of the specific features of the facial expressions, because we did not observe significant changes in the fusiform and in the amygdala. And here are some of the references of the papers that I presented here today, and also of some other relevant papers that of research that we have carried out related to the use of virtual reality to reduce domestic violence and enhance empathy in offenders. And also, I want to thank to all the researchers that have been implicated in the studies that I presented today. Thank you very much for your attention.